sessions. This morning I'm studying for the LSAT, and then after that I have to work on a PowerPoint for my GRE position. So you know the drill by now with the graduate study sessions, watch some videos, do some practice problems, and generally end with a drill for it. I'm also working on a research project, so for this I have to time how long I'm productive for. So let me set my timer or stopwatch.
In this next set of questions, we're still going to deal with flawed or reasoning, but we're going to deal with a different type of flaw. I think of this as a formal flaw, in contrast to the informal flaws. We just got out of the large set of causal questions. Right? The causal reasoning is an informal mode of reasoning. Right? You'll never reach validity. At best, you're going to reach an argument that's strong or, at worst, weak. Formal reasoning is kind of different, right? Formal reasoning, you dealt with this in sufficient assumption, you dealt with this in must be true. You're dealing with arguments that potentially could be valid, but for the fact that it committed some formal reasoning error. Okay, so now I'm talking about conditional logic. I'm talking about the logic of sets and subsets, right, and intersections between sets. That's the kind of logical error we're going to encounter in this question and the following set of questions. So with that, let's dive in. Let's explore what the flaws look like here, and we'll even notice some similarities between what we encounter in this set of questions and the questions that we have already done. Okay, so the Journal Assess Manufacturers Trade Group has long kept its membership list secret. They inadvertently sent me a document consisting a list of hundreds of manufacturing companies. Okay, so it looks like he got the inside scoop. Right? Secretive list was accidentally leaked to him. A representative of the trade group later confirmed that every company listed in the document does indeed belong to the trade group. Great, so now he has confirmation that the list is accurate. And that is, if a company is on the list, right, there are hundreds of companies on the list, if a company is on the list, then it definitely has membership in the trade group, right? Where's this argument going, though? We got one more sentence left. Because Brooke Industries is not listed in the document, it is evidently not a member of the trade group. I don't know about that. Right? All of these are premises, supposedly supporting, but we know it doesn't, right? Because it's flawed. But why not? Right? Why not? One good thing about formal logic errors is that you can fully anticipate what's going to happen. Right? You're not going to be able to anticipate the particular phrasing of the answer choice, but you can definitely anticipate the logical error. Okay, remember we practiced this a lot back in PSA questions, in SA questions, and a lot of MBT questions. Here with this question, we're going to analyze the flaw using 3 different frameworks.
Hello, Cooper. Hi, everyone. Right now I'm studying, so I'm watching some videos and I'll do some practice questions, so feel free to leave a comment and I'll respond to it once I'm finished studying. Hello, Elon. Hi, Doormob Man. Welcome back. Welcome, everyone. So back to studying.
That triangulate on the same issue. And the first framework I want to use is that of sufficiency versus necessity. This is the oldest mistake in the book. You dealt with this a lot in PSA questions. A ton of wrong answers were wrong because they confused sufficiency for necessity. That's exactly what's happening here. What is sufficient for what? Well, here it says every company listed, right? Every company on the list, in other words, has membership in the trade group, right? So if you are on the list, then you definitely belong to the trade group. Being on the list is sufficient, in other words, for being in the trade group. But nowhere did it say that being in the trade group is sufficient for being on the list. Or in other words, being on the list is necessary for being on the trade group. I can not be on the list and still be in the trade group. That's possible. But the journalist treated it as if the arrow flowed this way. That's why the journalists argue like this. Oh, you know what? Brooke Industries is not on the list. Hence, I conclude Brooke Industries is not part of the trade group. You see, I mean, if the original premise was this way, this is a perfectly valid argument. Being on the list is necessary for being in the trade group. Brooke Industries not on the list, great. Contrapose back, it's not in the trade group. But the problem is that your premise, you interpreted the premise incorrectly. You, the journalist, confused sufficient conditions for necessary conditions. That's one framing. Here's the second framing. There's a difference between something, a list in particular, being accurate versus a list being complete. Just because a list is accurate doesn't mean it's complete. Just because a list is complete doesn't mean it contains no inaccuracies. Accurate just means that everybody on the list indeed belongs to the trade group. You didn't include any false positives. Completeness means you didn't leave anybody out. Those are different concepts. All we know from the stimulus is that the list, right, this list is an accurate list. If A company is on this list, well then you know what? A company is in the trade group. B company is on the list. B company trade group. C company is on the list. Oh wait, no, C company isn't in a trade group. But that's not possible, right? Because the list is accurate. This is an example of an inaccurate list. So you see, if a company is in the list, it has to be in the trade group. D company, so on and so forth. But what if the list just stopped here? It's still an accurate list. Do you know if it's a complete list? We have no idea. And if you don't know if it's a complete list, you cannot make the kind of argument that the journalist is making, because the list could be incomplete. That means if E company is not on the list, or if Brooke company is not on the list, they may still be in the trade group, because nobody ever said the list was complete. We only said the list was accurate. Okay, different framing of the issue. Here's the final framing. Set versus superset. Or to be more explicit, we're talking about subset versus superset. It could very well be that this list is a subset of everybody who is in the trade group. In other words, the trade group could be, you can see it's a superset, right? Because they're companies that are not in the list but still in the trade group. So the trade group could be a superset of the people in the list. Already you're starting to see how this is, the same thing, right? Superset out here, subset in here, that's the same thing, sufficiency and necessity. Right? Being in the list is sufficient for being in the trade group, but that doesn't mean trade group is sufficient for being in the list. Trade group could be a larger set. Okay, three different ways, three different framings of the same issue. Now B says, the journalist doesn't provide any evidence that the document names every member of the trade group. Yeah, that's exactly the issue. There's no evidence that the list is complete. Right? They went with this framing. There's really no way you can anticipate what they're going to say. They could have just said something like, oh, the journalist confused a sufficient condition with a necessary condition. Okay, that would also be right. So this is why I want you to be familiar with all three different framings, because I want you to be flexible. The test is flexible. It's very flexible in how it crafts the right answer. So we have to be flexible too, right? So let's practice a little bit. What if the answer said the argument assumes without warrant, right? The argument assumes without warrant that what? That the document names every member of the trade group. And that's it, actually. You don't have to change anything else here. Right? What if I said the argument fails to consider the possibility that, what would you have to say? Fails to consider the possibility that the document doesn't name every member of its trade group. Right? You have to like I said, we could even be more dramatic in changing up the phrasing. It could just talk about sufficiency and necessity. You could talk about completeness versus accuracy in explicit terms. Okay, but this is probably good enough for practice. Next up, I want to consider A, C, and D together. Right, A says, journalist gives no reason to think that Brooke Industries will want to belong to the trade group. Yeah, true, descriptively accurate. C says, journalist does not explain how it is that the trade group could have inadvertently sent out a secret. Yeah, absolutely, I'm curious. How did this happen? Journalist doesn't explain this. Descriptively accurate. D says, journalist provides no reason why Brooke Industries would not want its membership in the trade group to be known. Yeah, the journalist doesn't give me any reason why Brooke Industry wants to be secretive about this. Right? I have no reason to believe that it would. Okay, so all three answers are descriptively accurate, but none of those concerns are relevant. They're not relevant because they have no bearing on the reasoning. Whether Brooke Industries wants to be in the trade group, you can toggle this answer however you want. Yes, no, strongly yes, strongly no. Doesn't matter. The journalist still committed a sufficiency and necessity error, but the logic is still flawed for the reason why it was always flawed. It has nothing to do with this. And same here. Sure, have the journalist explain how the list was inadvertently leaked. Okay, it's still going to have no bearing on the fact that you committed a sufficiency and necessity error. Right? Same thing here. Fine, give me a reason why Brooke Industries want to be secretive or not. You know what? Actually, never mind. I don't really care because it doesn't have any bearing on the logic of this argument. Now, finally, E says the journalist takes for granted the accuracy of a statement by a representative who had reason to withhold information. Sure, yeah, you're talking about the representative had reason to withhold information. This representative, sure, yeah, right, they're secretive after all. And the journalist does assume that when the representative confirmed that every member listed in the document belongs to a trade group, the journalist does take this to be true. So it's, again, descriptively accurate. But you know what? That's not the issue here, right? The issue is not that, oh, you journalists thought this was an accurate list, but maybe it's an inaccurate list, right? Oh, you thought being on the list is sufficient for being in the trade group, but maybe it's not sufficient, right? Oh, you thought this was a subset for this superset trade group, but maybe it's not a subset, right? Maybe it's just only partially overlapping, right? Maybe it's not maybe it's not accurate. Maybe B is in the list, but B actually doesn't belong to the trade group, right? Maybe A is on the list, but you know what? A actually doesn't belong in the trade group. Shouldn't have been in the list. Is that the issue? No, because you know why? Brooke Industries wasn't even on the list in the first place, right? It wasn't. It was out here. See, I think maybe you can understand this one better by once again changing this argument. Well, let's imagine everything stays the same, but now the argument goes because Brooke Industries is listed on it evidently is a member of the trade group. Right? Let's imagine a journalist made this argument. Somebody claimed that, oh, everybody on the list belongs to a trade group. Look, Brooke Industries is on the list. Therefore, I conclude Brooke Industries is a member of the trade group. Well, now we've accounted for the sufficiency and necessity confusion. Right? He's no longer making that mistake. So now his argument is vulnerable to having taken for granted the accuracy of a statement by a representative who had a reason to hold information. Meaning, this claim, the central premise in his argument that being on the list means that you have membership in the trade group, right? That's one of the central premises because his new argument now says Brooke Industries is on the list, therefore Brooke Industries is a member of the trade group. If this claim turns out to be false, that's devastating for his argument, obviously. But you know what? This is not a flaw. It certainly isn't a formal flaw. It's just a question of whether or not you can trust this representative. If you can trust this representative, then this argument is valid. Okay, so I would argue that even then, there's a distinction between a weakness in the reasoning versus the reasoning being flawed. But anyway, that's
Hey guys, now it's time to do a practice problem. Welcome everyone, all the new people. Thank you to everyone who's been subscribed for so long. Welcome, Moo Cow, glad you're here. Oops, what do these comments say? Yep, I would greatly appreciate your subscriptions, guys. I'm on my way to 1,000 subscribers. So once we get to 1,000, we can get monetized and I can potentially get paid for doing these lives. So please do consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Yeah, I hit 760 when I wasn't able to go live, so that was pretty cool. Okay guys, so back to practice problem. Feel free to continue leaving your questions, like the video, and please guys consider subscribing. Later on today we're going to the gym, so if you want to see me at the gym, subscribe so you can come back and see that.
Okay, let's take a look at how you did on this question. Starting with question stem, argument most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it has done something bad. So let's take a look at what logical error this science journalist committed. She tells us that Europa, a moon of Jupiter, is covered with ice. Great, so Europa is covered with ice. Data recently transmitted by a spacecraft strongly suggests that there are oceans of liquid water deep under the ice. Oh, so it's covered with ice on the surface, but we strongly suspect the presence of liquid oceans under that icy surface. Okay, life as we know it could evolve only in the presence of liquid water. Now this is a causal claim. The claim is that life as we know it requires liquid water to evolve. So it's a special kind of cause, right? It is a necessary cause. All right, and now we get to the conclusion. The these are premises that supposedly support this conclusion. Of course it doesn't, because we know there's some deep logical issue here. Hence, it's likely that at least primitive life has evolved on your, what? Huh? This doesn't make any sense at all. Now, if I were to force you to use the lens of sufficiency and necessity confusion to frame what is happening here, what would you say? I hope you say something like, the premises laid out a necessary causal condition for the evolution of life, which is liquid water, right? That is necessary, right? Only, could evolve only in the presence. But the argument mistook that as a sufficient causal condition. Right, the argument, the science journalist thought that this is a sufficient causal condition, which is why she reached the conclusion that there's primitive life, because she thought, oh, look, we found liquid water. Liquid water is sufficient for life to be there. Well, then there must at least be primitive life. Right, that's the sufficiency necessity lens. Okay, now if you take the framing of causation, which I hope you haven't forgotten yet, we did a bunch of causal questions, right? You know, just because we identified a cause as a necessary cause, well, there could be other necessary causes, right? There could be other non-necessary but causal factors, right? Necessary causes aren't necessarily sufficient causes, and that's sounding a lot like the sufficiency necessity framing again. Okay, so the argument here perhaps assumed that there were no other causal conditions, and on the back of that fallacious, unwarranted, questionable assumption, it concluded that Europa must have some life. And that's just what we find in answer choice B. The argument fails to address adequately the possibility that there are conditions necessary for the evolution of life in addition to the presence of liquid water. Right? Imagine that this were true. Right? It's true that there are conditions necessary for the evolution of life in addition to the presence of liquid water. Well, now this argument is dead. Okay, so I wanted you to use the sufficiency necessity framing because while this is exactly what the answer choice says, obviously, it didn't have to say that. The test writers are really flexible with how they phrase the correct and incorrect answers. If you found an answer that says something like, oh, it confused a necessary condition for a sufficient condition, well, yeah, that would also be correct. Okay, so let's practice rephrasing, but maybe in a limited scope where we kind of play around with this. Right, let's say the argument is vulnerable criticism on the grounds that it assumes without warrant. What? Assumes without warrant that there are no other conditions necessary for the evolution of life in addition to the presence of liquid water. Right? You have to edit this. Okay, how about the argument neglects the possibility that what? That there are conditions necessary. So in that framing, you don't have to change anything, right? Or rather, in that phrasing, you don't have to change anything. How about the argument overlooks the possibility that what? You also don't have to change anything, just like this. Okay, so B is the correct answer, but the other answers here are kind of attractive. A, I think, is probably the most attractive of the wrong answers. It says that the argument takes for granted that if a condition will be necessary for the evolution of life as we know it, then such life could not have evolved anywhere that this condition does not hold. We need to parse this to understand what this is saying. What's the condition? What is the condition that's necessary for the evolution of life was there water, right? Then, if that's true, right, the argument is saying, the answer is saying, if that's true, then such life couldn't evolve anywhere without water. Well, the argument doesn't take this for granted. Here's what the argument takes for granted. That if a condition would be necessary for evolution of life as we know it, then such life, we have to edit this now, would have evolved everywhere that this condition holds. That's what this argument takes for granted. That if you have a condition necessary for the evolution of life as we know it, and here we do, check, right, water is that condition, then such life would have evolved everywhere that this condition holds. Yeah, that's why the journalist jumps to the conclusion that there's at least primitive life on Europa. Why? Because Europa has that condition, has water. Right? Edited this way, A accurately captures confusing a necessary condition for a sufficient condition. Okay, but as you can see, that's not what originally A says. So yeah, no good. But what originally A says is interesting too, because this is not a logical error. In other words, we already mentioned this argument doesn't take this for granted. But had an argument taken this for granted, it would not have been guilty of any logical crime, because this is just accurately describing what it means for a condition to be necessary, right? If truly water is necessary for evolution of life as we know it, then anywhere you don't have water, you're not gonna have life. What's wrong with that? That's just what it means for something to be a necessary condition. So you see, the test writers are like really trying to mess with us here. This claim here and this claim here, yeah, they do exist in this relationship. If this claim is true, then this claim has to be true, because that's what it means for a condition to be necessary. C says that the argument takes for granted that life is likely to be present on Europa if but only if life evolved on Europa. Okay, no, this is descriptively inaccurate because the argument doesn't take this for granted. You'll notice that both the premise and conclusion talk about the evolution of life on Europa, not just the mere presence, of life. Right? We are talking about the evolution of life in both the premises and conclusion. But had there been an illicit move in the argument from premise that spoke to the evolution of life to a conclusion that spoke to the mere presence of life, then maybe C might have been onto something. Right? Of course, we don't want to mistakenly assume that life can be present, right? Present on Europa but only if life evolved on Europa. This is not a good assumption. It's unwarranted. In fact, it's unwarranted in either direction. Right? Let's just deal with this direction first. In order for life to be present, it must have evolved. This is not a warranted assumption, because you know how else life could be present on Europa? We could bring it to Europa, right? Like imagine if we sent a probe to Europa and just like packed the probe full of microbes or whatever. Great, now you got life present on Europa without it having evolved on Europa. So you see, this is not a warranted assumption. It's just not true that for life to be present, it must have evolved there. Okay, now let's think about the other direction. Why is it unwarranted in this direction? Right? If life evolved in Europa, it must be present on Europa. No, because life could have once evolved on Europa, but you know what? Unfortunately, it died out. Right? So yeah, look, life evolved, but that doesn't mean it's present because it died out. So you see, in either direction of the conditional is unwarranted. All right, so backing up, that's just to say that had the argument taken this for granted, that truly would be a vulnerability, right? Why? Because, we just talked about why. But the problem with C is that the argument doesn't take this for granted. D says that the argument overlooks the possibility that there could be unfamiliar forms of life that have evolved without the presence of liquid water. Okay, I guess if I were to be super charitable to D, then sure, you're descriptively accurate, but you're still not pointing out why the argument is weak. It doesn't matter that the argument overlooked this possibility. We can demonstrate this by just conceding this point. Sure, yeah, there could be unfamiliar forms of life that evolved in waterless places. What does that have to do with Europa? What does that have to do with life as we know it? Europa has water. Life as we know it requires water to evolve. And the conclusion is what it is because argument committed not this flaw. right? Committed the flaw that we already talked about. Okay, now I think maybe to better see D, you might want to think about what kind of argument would be most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that overlook the possibility it could have been. In other words, how do we edit this such that D is the right answer? Guarantee you will encounter an argument in the future where this is the right answer, or at least the logic captured here. Maybe not the content, right? Maybe not about liquid water or whatever. But let's make up an argument, okay? Let's say premise one is that life as we know it could have evolved only in the presence of liquid water. We know there's no liquid water on Titan, also a moon. Hence, life could not have evolved there in any form. Well, that argument overlooks a possibility that could be unfamiliar forms of life that evolved without the presence of liquid water. E says the argument takes for granted that no conditions on Europa, other than the supposed presence of liquid water, could have accounted for the data transmitted by the spacecraft. Interesting. So there's definitely data transmitted by spacecraft, which strongly suggests that there is liquid water under the ice. Now, if we're to be charitable to this argument, presumably the scientists processed this data and analyzed it before they declared, oh, the data strongly suggests there's water. In other words, they're kind of explaining what the data is. Their explanation of the data is that there's water. That's what counts for this data. Again, I think we have to be charitable here. We don't know how did this inference making process occur? We don't really know, right? But what E is claiming is that they didn't do their due diligence. Right? When they say strongly suggest, don't interpret that as, oh, they processed the data, they analyzed the data, they thought about alternative explanations, and they reached the conclusion that, you know what, it's water. No, that's not what happened. They just assumed, right? They just assumed that it was liquid water, right? They just assumed that it was an instrument malfunction. They just assumed that it wasn't some interference. They just assumed that there weren't any other explanations that could have accounted. See, this is quite uncharitable. For E to be, if you want to say E is descriptively accurate of this, you are taking a very, very uncharitable reading, okay? We don't have that information, right? Knowing what we know about this, right? It's data, these are space scientists, right? Probably they, did their homework before they arrived at this explanation. Okay, so that's probably the strongest reason why E is not right. It's just not descriptively accurate. But you know what? Even if we bend over backwards and kind of straw man this argument, right? Be like, oh, you just assumed it's water. Okay, fine, but I mean, that's still just pointing out a weakness in this argument. It is not pointing out the biggest weakness in the argument. Why? Because the argument still contains this huge logical error of confusing a necessary condition for a sufficient condition. Right? Now, I'm not saying the test writers will ever put you in a situation, I don't think they will, where you have to really weigh, oh, is it this error that's more vulnerable? Is it that error that's more vulnerable? Right? This is about as close as it gets. They'll first make you bend over backwards to do something else that's not quite right before you even get to making that relative weakness.
To follow and most accurately describes the reporter's error in reasoning. To study the competitive effectiveness of two experiments one could receive only medication and reasoning in the counselor's argument is most vulnerable to criticism. Those who believe that criticism should be gentle rather than harsh should consider the following.
All right, let's take a look how you did on this question. It's a flawed descriptive weakening question, right? Reasoning, vulnerable to criticism. Now, hopefully being in this set, you recognize that it is a question that commits the sufficiency, necessity, confusion mistake, but it's kind of hard to see how that happens because the stimulus itself is, it's fairly convoluted. So definitely worthwhile digging in, carefully examining where the argument went wrong. So the counselor says, those who believe that criticism should be gentle rather than harsh should consider the following. Oh, wow, okay, I feel like I'm getting admonished, right? Don't you feel like you're getting admonished? Like she's like, listen, softy, right? I know you believe that criticism should be nice and gentle and stuff, right, and not harsh, but I got something to tell you, right? Okay, what do you have to say? Change requires a motive, and criticism that's unpleasant provides a motive. Oh, all right. That's right. This is stuff I can represent using conditional language, right? Change. What about change? Well, it requires a motive. No motive, no change. I'm thinking like, yeah, I guess this makes sense. If someone doesn't have a motive to change, why would they change, right? By the way, I'm using conditional logic to represent the relationship, but that doesn't mean this is the only relationship. Okay, there's also a causal relationship I'm just choosing not to represent, or because the conditional relationship will force out what's wrong with this argument more obviously, right, visually more obviously than the causal. But I don't want you to think that, right? It is a causal relationship, right? Like, why do people change? Their behavior, their personality, whatever it is that you're criticizing them. Well, they have a reason to change. They have a motive to change, right? That makes sense. Okay. Anyway, let's keep going here. Criticism that's unpleasant provides a motive, right? Yeah, this also kind of makes sense. You know what provides a motive? Unpleasant criticism, right? Again, if I just think about this, sure, if someone harshly criticizes me, yeah, I can see how that could give me a motive, right? I want to prove them wrong, right? I'll show you, right? Something like that. I don't know. Okay, so fine, right? Change requires a motive, and unpleasant criticism is one way to give somebody a motive. And now we have two more sentences. I see a since. So I'm thinking this is premise conclusion, right? Premise conclusion with this comma. Premise conclusion. But wait, I also see a therefore. So what's going on? I'm already suspecting that this is the main conclusion. Right? I mean, we are in flaw descriptive weakening territory. If we were in, say, main conclusion, right, main point or main conclusion territory, I will be highly skeptical that this is the main conclusion, because I'd be like, oh, I don't know, this might be a trap. Right? But typically, when you're in like flaw questions, weakening questions, whatever, they really don't mess with us that hard on, sort of where the main conclusion is. But anyway, this will be the hypothesis for now, right? Where here we have a sub-conclusion, right, supporting the main conclusion down over here, and we'll soon see that, yeah, that's right. Okay, so harsh criticism is unpleasant. Harsh criticism provides a motive, right? Since harsh criticism is unpleasant, put that together with the previous claim, right? Unpleasant criticism provides a motive. What is unpleasant criticism? Well, it's a set. Right? There are all sorts of ways you can be unpleasant when you give criticism. One of those ways is to be harsh about it. Right? So, but what we said is that entire superset of unpleasant criticism provides a motive, and if harsh criticism is now told to us as a subset of this bigger set, right? If harsh criticism is unpleasant, well then of course harsh criticism also provides a motive, right? So there's nothing wrong with this line of reasoning. This line of reasoning is pretty straightforward, right? You're just saying the superset does a thing, and then you're saying, oh, this other thing is a subset of the superset. Well, if the entire superset does a thing, then surely the subset also does the thing. Okay, that's in general abstracted terms of what's happening here. Okay, so having said that, we don't really care about this superset now providing a motive. The reason is because the conclusion talks about harsh criticism, right? So we can now just replace this with harsh criticism. I'm not saying it's just harsh criticism that provides a motive because, well, we already know the entire superset of unpleasant criticism provides a motive. But I'm replacing it with harsh criticism because that's what the conclusion is about, right? Harsh criticism provides a motive. Fine. Okay, so now considering our major premises, change requires motive. Harsh criticism provides a motive. Here comes the conclusion. Only harsh criticism will cause the person to change. What? Okay, so only is signaling necessary, right? Necessity. So you want somebody to change, you know what you need? You need harsh criticism, right? So hopefully you can already see just in the way that the arrows are pointing, this is not right. This doesn't follow. Change requires a motive. Now, if it has said only harsh criticism can provide a motive, then the arrow will be pointing this way, right? Then this will follow, right? Change requires motive. Motive requires harsh criticism. Okay, fine, then change requires harsh criticism. That follows logically, but that's not what it said, right? What it instead said is that harsh criticism provides a motive. Okay, I mean, but why does change require harsh, like, don't other things also provide motives? Right? In fact, we kind of know the answer to that is yes, because, you know, we were already told that unpleasant criticism provides motive. Presumably there are ways to be unpleasant without being harsh, right? But this is why we said unpleasant was a superset and harsh is just what is a subset. It's just one way to be unpleasant. You can be very mild and gentle and nonetheless cutting, right? And very unpleasant. But anyhow, I think we've identified the logical defect, which again is sufficiency, necessity, confusion. Right, sufficiency, necessity, confusion. Okay, so let's look at answer choice A, which is the right answer. It infers that something that is sufficient to provide motive is necessary to provide a motive. And so just a bit of grammar parsing. Something that is sufficient to provide a motive, that's the subject. And what about that something? That something is necessary to provide motive. The claim in A is that that's what the argument does. The argument inferred that something which is sufficient to provide motive. What is this something that's sufficient? Oh yeah, this is sufficient to provide a motive, right? The argument inferred that this thing which is sufficient to provide a motive, it inferred that it was necessary to provide a motive. Yeah, indeed it did. That's how it landed at this conclusion, right? I mean, there's something, I suppose, what's missing here is when I drew the arrow the other way, right? What's given to us is that something is sufficient to provide a motive, but the argument inferred that, oh, wait, this thing is necessary to provide a motive, right? And this is what it used along with this to get here, right? Now you can see change points to motive, which points to harsh criticism. Okay, so that's why A is the right answer. You don't get to infer that this is a mistake to infer something that's sufficient is also necessary. Okay, let's practice now phrasing this differently, right? What if I said the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it failed to consider that what? Failed to consider, try to use as much of this language as you can. It failed to consider that something which is sufficient to provide a motive may not be necessary to provide a motive. That's how you want to edit this. Okay, let's try this. The argument is vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that it presumes without justification that what? It presumes without justification that something sufficient to provide a motive is necessary to provide a motive. Right? That would also be right. B says it fails to address the possibility that in some cases, the primary goal of criticism is something other than bringing about change in the person being criticized. I mean, sure, it's descriptively accurate. The argument definitely failed to address the possibility that sometimes, you know, the primary goal of criticism is, it's not about making somebody change, right? Okay, that's fine, but man, that has nothing to do with this argument, right? Because this argument never pretended to talk about all the purposes of criticism, right? The argument is narrowly focused on talking about change, right? Change, which the argument claims requires a motive.
Hello everybody who's still on the live. Thank you so much for watching. For the new people, I'm studying for the LSAT right now, so it's mostly quiet because I want you to see what it's like when I'm really studying. But feel free, guys, to subscribe. We greatly appreciate your subscriptions. We're on our way to 1,000 subs. When we get to 1,000 subscribers, we get monetized. I can potentially pay off my undergrad student loan debt, graduate student loan debt, and I'll get paid for going live and posting videos, and that would be awesome. So let's make it a goal. By the end of the year, let's get to 1,000. So if you subscribed already, thank you so much. Thank you for staying on, Door Mob Bands. Really appreciate your support. Once I'm finished studying, I'm gonna start cleaning up. So for the cleaning up video, I'll start a new live for that in case anyone wants to see me clean. Because one thing I realized about YouTube, depending on the title or when you go live, they push it a little bit more. So yeah, once I'm done studying, I'll start a new live so you can see me cleaning up. And then I'm also gonna go live when I go to the gym later on. So if you guys wanna see me at the gym, then definitely subscribe so you could come back for my lives later. But back to another practice problem, guys. Application of principle. most vulnerable to takes for granted that a most considered product would buy. Keep a blind review and see.
Okay, let's take a look at how you did on this question. We have application principle, most vulnerable to criticism. So in the way this is set up, hopefully it reminds you of a lot of PSA questions, right? You have a principle or a rule and then an application of that rule. Here, the twist is that you have your rule, you have your conclusion, you got your premises, right? You got your facts, and then you have your attempt to draw a conclusion on the basis of the rule and the facts. But the problem is that there's some logical error made, and once again, hopefully it didn't come as a surprise that the logical error, sufficiency, necessity, confusion, right? So let's take a look at this principle. If a food product contains ingredients whose presence most consumers of that product would be upset to discover in it, then the food should be labeled as containing those ingredients. So if something, then something, very classic rule, right? If this condition is met, then here is the consequence. Now, let's map this out. How do you want to map something like this out? There's quite a bit of art to this, right? It's just a lot of information. The art here is distilling that information to the crucial piece of information. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it, but it's certainly one pretty good way of doing it, is just to say upset. Right? I mean, for me at least, when I see upset, I'm reminded of, okay, we're talking about food products, we're talking about who's upset? Consumers upset to discover that, cheese contains, I don't know, bacteria, right? I can see people getting upset discovering that, right? I mean, I don't know if you knew that, lots of cheeses and yogurts contain bacteria. So, okay, so if that's the case, then what's the consequence? The consequence is that it should be labeled. Right? Once again, I'm reducing all of this information to this symbol. Right? I'm reducing all of this information to this symbol. Okay, so now the rule is clear. If consumers will be upset to discover the thing in the product, then the product should be labeled as, oh, by the way, it contains live bacteria, something like that, right? Okay, here comes application. Crackly crisps need not be labeled as containing genetically engineered ingredients since, so this is the conclusion, right? This is the conclusion, this is a premise, right? The facts premise, and this is a rule premise, and this is a premise as well, supposedly supporting this conclusion. Since why? most consumers would not care if they discovered. See, this right over here, it's not explicitly saying most consumer wouldn't be upset, but it is saying enough to set us up for a proper inference. If most consumers wouldn't care if they discover that fact, then you can infer the premise that they would not be upset. Okay? So you probably already see the problem here from doing so much PSA and SA questions. You fail the sufficient condition rule. You do not get to draw the failure of the necessary condition as the conclusion. But that's exactly, right? That's exactly what happened for Crackly Crisps. Because most consumers wouldn't be upset, the argument concludes that therefore Crackly Crisps don't need to be labeled, right? Don't need to be labeled. That's not right. I mean, see, what the argument had in mind wasn't a rule like this. The argument had in mind a rule like this, right? Labeling requires that people be upset. Oh, for Crackly Crisp, people wouldn't be upset. Well, now you can probably contrapose back, therefore it doesn't need to be labeled. That would be a proper argument, okay? But unfortunately, the principle is this way, and this is not a proper argument. This is an argument that confuses sufficiency for necessity. You know, all cats are mammals. Crackly Crisp isn't a cat. Therefore, Crackly Crisp isn't a mammal. How do I know that? Right? Crackly Crisp could be what I name my dog, or rabbit, or whatever. Okay, so, anyway, do not confuse sufficiency for necessity. Here, the answer that gets to that is E. It's the last answer. It's also super confusingly worded. I mean, look at this. This is such a roundabout way of saying sufficiency, necessity, confusion. Confuses a claim that under certain conditions, certain action should be taken with a claim that the action need not be taken in the absence of those conditions. Wow. Listen, this is why practice is so important. I doubt that the first time you read this, you can be like, oh, duh, sufficiency, necessity, confusion. What, you need time to like process this? Come on. See, I'm hoping at some point you get to this place where you read a convoluted claim like that, and you actually don't need that much time to process this, okay? But you'll only arrive at that destination by taking it one step at a time, okay? It's a long road. You know, the first time you encounter this, there's no way around it. I mean, just look at this claim. There's so many words. There's grammar to get through, right? You have to parse it, okay? So let's do that. But what I'm promising you is that if you do this and you keep practicing and you keep doing this, you will get better and faster. And one day you're going to read something like that. Oh, I think it's actually just saying sufficiency, necessity, confusion. It'll just click. Okay, so here, what is a claim, right? That under certain conditions, a certain action should be taken, right? So we have a claim, right? This is one claim. This is all the modification of that claim. The answer choice is saying confuses this kind of claim with this other kind of claim. Right? It's confusing claim 1 with claim 2 is what it's saying. You confuse claim 1 with claim 2. What's 1? Well, 1 is the claim that under certain conditions, a certain action should be taken. Does that happen here? Under what condition should a certain action be taken? Well, under the condition that some people will be upset. Right? That's the certain condition. What's the action that should be taken? The action that should be taken is that, oh, well, you should label that yogurt contains live bacteria, right? Okay, so sure, that's the claim, right? That is the original claim. Under certain conditions, people being upset, an action should be taken, you gotta label it, that's the claim. And we said that the confusion here, right, based on this argument, is it made a sufficiency necessity confusion, right? This argument thought the claim was, oh, you know what? If not upset, then not label, right? Then not label. Right? See, that's why they said, oh, look, Crinkly Crisp, Crackly Crisp, whatever, not upset. Therefore, Crackly Crisp don't label. Now, this is one way to say it, right? But of course, the contrapositive is just a label arrow up set, right? That's the contrapositive, label arrow up set. You see, that's just the same thing as flipping this arrow around, okay? You can't confuse these two, right? Because, I mean, yeah, these two are equivalent claims, but neither of these is equivalent to this, yet that's exactly what argument did. Argument thought this was the same as this, because look at this. This is the claim that I got confused with, that an action need not be taken. Hey, look, there's the action. That doesn't need to be taken in the absence of those conditions. Yeah, the absence, right? You see the absence of those conditions. It confused this claim with this claim. Now you see why it's just a roundabout way of saying confusing sufficient conditions for necessary conditions. Okay. Think we can practice with rephrasing this. Let's say the argument, instead of confuse this claim with this claim, let's say the argument assumes without warrant that because a certain action should be taken under certain conditions, what? That the action need not be taken in the absence of those conditions. Right? The argument assumes that because certain actions should be taken under certain conditions, because that's true, the argument assumes that the action doesn't need to be taken in the absence of those conditions, right? In the absence of those conditions, the action doesn't need to be taken. Again, it's just a different way of saying confusing this claim for this claim, right? A different way of saying confuse sufficiency for necessity. Okay, so hopefully you're starting to see why I'm really stressing this idea of being flexible, because there's just so many different ways of phrasing these logical errors. A says it fails to address the possibility that consumers of a specific food may not be representative of consumers of food in general. Okay. Yeah, I guess the argument failed to address this possibility, and it's definitely a possibility that consumers of, say, crackly crisps, those consumers may not represent consumers of food in general. That's true. And did the argument address this possibility? No, it didn't. But why did it need to address this possibility? It's a good thing that it didn't address this possibility, because this is irrelevant. Okay, this is irrelevant. Now, to see why this is irrelevant, think about what kind of reasoning this answer choice has in mind, right? We talked about this before in previous questions. This is the kind of reasoning when your premises are specific and you're trying to use those specific premises to reach a general conclusion, right? You're trying to use, say, premises about a sample to reach a conclusion about a population. That mode of reasoning is where the issue of representativeness comes up, right? If you're trying to lean on premises about a sample, yet your conclusion is about something more broad, more general, a superset, well then you better make sure the subset is representative of the superset. Okay, but that's not what's happening here. This is not the kind of argument that reasons from specific premises to general conclusions. I suppose it could have been, maybe you say something like, look, surveys have robustly demonstrated that consumers of crackly crisps, they don't care about genetically engineered ingredients. Okay, so that's your premise, right? Hence, the population at large doesn't care about genetically engineered ingredients in foods. Right? Like, okay, now you are possibly guilty of this, right? Because now your premise is specific, it's narrow, your conclusion is broad, it's general. You better make sure that crackly crisps represent people in general with respect to caring or not caring about, genetically engineered ingredients. Okay, so that's why A isn't right. Now, if you notice, like this argument actually goes in the opposite direction. It doesn't reason from small to big. It kind of reasons from general to specific, right? Because look at this. This is a rule that is general. We talked about this a lot in PSA. Most PSA questions employ this kind of reasoning, right? A rule, by definition, a rule applies to many different cases, right? So you're using a general claim as your premise, and you're trying to reason narrowly, right? You're trying to say, oh, this is the rule that applies. Well, here I'm talking about a specific case, right? So I want to use this rule to talk about my specific case, and my conclusion is narrower, right? My conclusion is about the specific case, right? So it's kind of in the opposite direction of what A is contemplating. B says it fails to address the possibility that the genetically engineered ingredients Crackly Crisp may have been proven safe for human consumption. Okay, what? Who cares? Right? Seriously, who cares? I don't care. Because whether or not the genetically engineered ingredients have been proven safe for human consumption has no bearing on the logic of this argument. You don't want to be confused here, right? We are just doing argument analysis. Right? We're trying to figure out what the premises are, what the conclusion is, why the reasoning doesn't work out. Okay, I'm not a consumer of crackly chips. Now, if I were a consumer of crackly chips, well then, yeah, of course I want to make sure that, forget any ingredient, even the natural ones, have been proven safe for human consumption, right? I mean, of course I would care about that, but I don't, Crackly Crisp isn't even real, I don't think, actually. Don't Google me on that. But, here, we're just analyzing this argument, okay? And this has no bearing on it. C says the argument implicitly makes use of a value judgment incompatible with the principle being applied. What? No, it doesn't, right? It doesn't do that. There's definitely a principle here. That's the principle that it's trying to apply. And sure, there exists value judgments incompatible with this, but the argument doesn't implicitly use any of them, right? It's just a straightforward application of the principle. The only error was that it misunderstood the principle. It thought the principle went like this. Okay, but actually, I do think it is worthwhile. Take some time, maybe like a minute or two. Try to see if you can think up a value judgment that would be incompatible, right? So first, I think you have to tease out what a value judgment, what kind of value is contained in this principle. And if you can tease out the value that's contained in this principle, then you can just contradict that value, and then you'll find a value judgment that's incompatible with this principle. Okay, I'll let you think about that. You can check the written part of this lesson for my results. And lastly, D says, takes for granted that if most consumers of a product will buy it, the product, even if they knew several of the ingredients, then they would buy the product even if they knew all the ingredients. What? Do you understand this? I'm not really understanding this, so I have no choice but to spend time and parse it, right? But parse it. Okay, let's do that. Let's say Crackly Crisps contain, 100 ingredients in total. So what is it saying? It's taking for granted that if most consumers of a product, Crackly Crisp, will buy the product. Okay, so we got willing buyers of Crackly Crisps, right? Even if they knew several, so these are consumers who want to buy Crackly, and they know, like, say, 7 of the ingredients in the product. Then they will buy the product, even if they knew. Oh, okay, so D is claiming that, yeah, they only know 7 of the products, right? And they would, 7 of the ingredients in the product, and they will buy it. But even if they had known all of the ingredients, the remaining 93 ingredients, they would still buy the product. That's what D is saying. right? Like, okay, yes, still no, you're still the wrong answer. I haven't changed my mind about that. But now I do have a better handle on what kind of claim this is, right? What this means. Now, interestingly enough, this is also, right, this kind of assumption, takes for granted this assumption, it's also a kind of flawed specific to general reasoning that we encountered in answer choice A, right? Because it is highly questionable. If you take this for granted, you're in danger because it is highly questionable whether this is true. Let's say I buy Crackly Crisp and I know 7 of the ingredients. How are you saying that if you gave me additional information, if you told me what the remaining 93 ingredients were, that I would still buy it? Well, you're implicitly assuming that the 7 ingredients that is, pushing me to buy the product is representative of the remaining 93 ingredients. Right? What if the 7 ingredients that I know in Crackly Crisp, like salt, I like that, fat, I like that, sugar, I like that. What if they're not representative of the remaining? You know what ingredient 97 is? Radioactive uranium. Right. Okay, well, nah, no thanks. Kind of don't want to buy it anymore. So, you see, inherent in this assumption is that specific to general, right? Is that issue of representativeness.
Going up to 150. I'm gonna have to take this test more than once. There's nothing. blind review. Well, guys, I'm gonna log off now. I'm gonna study on my own, and then I'll come back on when I'm cleaning. So feel free to subscribe to the channel and share it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back soon, guys. Bye.